Mister, are you hurt?
I'm fine. Just need a moment.
You don't look fine. Our house is close. My daddy will help you. He's strong. He can carry you if you can't walk.
The gunshot cracked through the marble hall before anyone understood what was happening. Glass shattered. A chandelier swung violently overhead, throwing broken light across the floor. Men in dark suits dove for cover behind overturned tables, and somewhere near the back exit, a woman screamed. In the chaos, one man moved differently than the rest, not fleeing blindly, but calculating, cutting sideways through the panic like a blade through smoke. That man was Kang Min-yi. But before we understand why bullets were flying through a peace meeting meant to end a war, we need to rewind just slightly to a quiet street an hour later, where a 12-year-old girl named Ha-yoon was walking home from the pharmacy, clutching a small paper bag of medicine against her chest. If this kind of story pulls you in, the kind with danger, family, and quiet acts of courage, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 30 minutes will stay with you long after the video ends. Ha-yoon walked slowly, careful not to jostle the bag. Her mother's fever had spiked again the night before, and the pharmacist had told her, gently, that this medicine needed to be taken exactly on time. She kept glancing at the paper, checking the dosage her father had scribbled beside the pharmacy's instructions, when she noticed something strange leaning against the low stone wall bordering the alley near her house. At first she thought it was a pile of dark cloth someone had discarded. Then it moved. A man, sitting slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, his black suit dusted with dirt and streaked with something darker that Ha-yoon didn't yet understand was blood. His breathing was ragged, shallow, like each inhale cost him something. She stopped walking. Her small hands tightened around the paper bag. "Mister," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Mister, are you hurt?" He lifted his head slowly. His eyes were sharp despite the pain behind them, the eyes of a man used to controlling every room he entered, now humbled by something he couldn't control at all. He tried to push himself up off the ground, his palms scraping against the stone, but his legs buckled beneath him, and he sank back down with a stifled groan. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him, cracking on the second word. "Just need a moment." Ha-yoon didn't move away. Most adults told children to run from strangers who looked like this, bloodied, desperate, clearly running from something. But Ha-yoon had grown up in a house where her father always said kindness wasn't measured by how much you had, but by how much you were willing to give when you had nothing. She knelt down beside him, setting the medicine bag carefully on the ground. "You don't look fine," she said simply. "Our house is close. My daddy will help you. He's strong. He can carry you if you can't walk." Min-yi studied her for a long moment. This child, no older than his own younger cousin had been the last time he'd seen her, was offering to bring a bleeding, hunted stranger into her home without a second thought. He should have refused. Every instinct trained into him over 15 years of survival told him to refuse, to disappear into the shadows and find his own way to safety, to never expose innocent people to the storm chasing him. But his body had other plans. Blood loss was making the edges of his vision swim, and the safe house he'd been trying to reach was still 2 kilometers away. A distance that, in his current state, might as well have been 100. "All right," he breathed, letting himself lean just slightly toward the small hand she extended. Just for a little while." She helped him up with a strength that surprised him, bracing herself against his weight, guiding his arm over her thin shoulders. Together, step by unsteady step, They made their way down the quiet road toward a modest house with a wooden fence and smoke curling gently from its chimney. The title card faded in, Mr. Now let's go back 1 hour earlier to understand exactly what Kang Min-yi was running from, and why a peace meeting meant to end years of bloodshed turned into an ambush that nearly cost him his life. The meeting had been called at a neutral estate on the outskirts of the city, arranged after months of careful negotiation between Min-yi's organization and two rival factions who had, for years, bled each other dry over territory and pride. Min-yi had pushed for this peace harder than anyone. He was tired of funerals, tired of watching loyal men die for lines drawn on maps, tired of a war that had outlived whatever reason it once had. "You're certain about this?" his second-in-command Taejun had asked him that morning, adjusting his jacket in the car. "Choi's faction has never wanted peace. Not really." "Director Choi doesn't get a vote," Min-yi had replied, watching the city blur past the window. The elders agreed. "It's time this ends." Director Choi, a name that would matter a great deal in the hours to come. The meeting itself had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. Papers were signed. Hands were shaken. There was even laughter, cautious and unfamiliar after years of hostility, as old enemies spoke to each other like men who might someday become something less than enemies. Min-yi remembered feeling something close to hope as he watched it unfold. Then, just as the room began to empty, the lights cut out. Gunfire erupted from the balcony above, precise, coordinated, clearly planned in advance by someone who knew exactly when and where everyone would be standing. Min-yi's bodyguards moved instantly, forming a wall around him, weapons drawn, shouting instructions that blurred together in the chaos. "Down, get down." Across the room, half hidden by an overturned table, 3 men from the rival factions did not flee like the others. They exchanged a brief, knowing glance, men who had orchestrated the very ambush that was now supposedly threatening their own lives, before slipping toward a side exit, blending seamlessly into the panic they had helped create. "Sir, we have to move now," one of Min-yi's bodyguards yelled, grabbing his arm. "Where's Taejun?" Min-yi demanded, scanning the smoke-filled room. "He's covering the west exit. He told us to get you out first. Run." Min-yi didn't want to run. Every part of him wanted to turn back, to find his men, to face whoever had done this. But he had learned long ago that a leader who dies out of pride leaves nothing behind but chaos for the people who trusted him. So he ran. He tore through side streets, alleys, and half-forgotten shortcuts he barely remembered from childhood visits to this part of the city, gunfire and shouting fading behind him with every turn. At some point, he wasn't sure when, a bullet grazed his side, a burning line of pain that he pressed his palm against and kept moving, because stopping meant dying. By the time the adrenaline began to fade and the pain caught up with him fully, he found himself in an unfamiliar, quiet neighborhood, collapsing against a low stone wall, his strength finally giving out. That is where Ha-yoon found him. Now back in the present, Ha-yoon guided Min-yi through the wooden gate of her family's small home. The moment they crossed the threshold, a man appeared from the side yard, broad-shouldered, sleeves rolled up, sawdust clinging to his forearms from whatever he'd been carving. This was Hyun, Ha-yoon's father, and the instant he saw the state of the stranger leaning on his daughter, he dropped the tool in his hand and rushed forward. "Ha-yoon, what happened? Who is this man?" "I found him by the wall, Daddy. He's hurt. I told him you'd help." Hyun's eyes swept over Min-yi, the blood-darkened suit, the pale face, the unmistakable signs of a gunshot wound, and for a brief moment, Hesitation flickered across his features. A man like this, dressed in a suit that cost more than Hyun made in half a year, bleeding from what was clearly violence, could bring danger to his family. He had a sick wife inside, a daughter who needed protecting. But then he looked at Min Yi's face, really looked, and saw not a threat, but a man utterly stripped of pretense, exhausted and afraid in a way that had nothing to do with status or power. "Get him inside," Hyun said finally, moving to take Min Yi's other arm. Quickly. Inside, the house was small but warm, filled with the particular kind of order that comes from people who have little and treat what they have with care. Hyun laid Min Yi down on a mat near the fire and immediately began examining the wound, his hands steady despite the urgency. "This needs cleaning," Hyun muttered, already reaching for a cloth and a kettle of hot water. "You're lucky. It grazed you deep, but it went through." "Thank you," Min Yi managed, gritting his teeth as the cloth pressed against the wound. "I won't stay long. I don't want to bring trouble to your home." "You're already in my home," Hyun said, not unkindly. "Trouble or not, I'm not sending a bleeding man back out into the street." From a curtained doorway at the back of the room, a small, weak voice called out, "Hyun, who's here?" "It's all right, Yoonjae," Hyun called back gently. "Rest, I'll explain later." Min Yi's eyes drifted toward the doorway, and Ha-yoon, noticing his gaze, spoke softly. "That's my mommy. She's sick, very sick, but she's going to get better soon, right, Daddy?" Hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he forced a small smile for his daughter. "That's right. She just needs rest and her medicine and time." Min Yi said nothing, but he noted the exhaustion etched into Hyun's face, the threadbare edges of the blanket covering him, the careful way the family rationed even something as simple as firewood. This was a household running on love far more than resources, and yet they had not hesitated for even a second to bring a stranger in from the cold. Something in Min Yi, something that had been closed off for a very long time, cracked just slightly. If you're feeling that crack too, that moment where the story starts to hit somewhere deeper than you expected, make sure to drop a comment below and let us know. We read every single one, and it helps this story reach more people who need to see it. Over the following days, Min Yi healed slowly under Hyun's rough but effective care. He learned, without ever explicitly asking, the shape of this family's daily struggle. Hyun worked from dawn until well past dark, taking on carpentry jobs across the neighborhood, often coming home with hands blistered and bleeding from labor that paid barely enough to cover Yoonjae's medicine. Ha-yoon, despite being only 12, had taken on responsibilities far beyond her years, cooking simple meals, tending to her mother, running errands, all while somehow maintaining a warmth and cheerfulness that seemed impossible given the weight on her small shoulders. "You don't have to do all this," Min Yi said one evening, watching Ha-yoon carefully spoon broth into her mother's mouth, patient and gentle despite Yoonjae's trembling hands. "Mommy did it for me when I was sick," Ha-yoon replied simply, as if this explained everything. "Now it's my turn." Min Yi found himself unable to respond to that. In his world, a world of hierarchies, of debts owed and favors traded, of loyalty bought with money or fear, the idea of help freely given, expecting nothing in return, had become almost foreign to him. He had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that this was how families were supposed to work. One night, unable to sleep, he found Hyun sitting alone by the dying fire, sanding down a small wooden toy, a horse, roughly carved but clearly made with care. "For Ha-yoon?" Min Yi asked, easing himself down nearby, his wound healing enough now that the movement no longer sent fire through his side. "Her birthday is next month," Hyun said, not looking up from his work. "I can't afford much, but I can make things with my hands. That has to be enough." "Does she know how much you sacrifice for her, for Yoon-jae?" Hyun paused, considering the question. "I don't think children are supposed to know that. Not fully. A parent's job is to carry the weight so the child doesn't have to. If she grows up and looks back one day and understands, that's enough for me. I don't need her to see it now." Min-yi stared into the fire for a long moment. "Where I come from," he said quietly, "everyone wants credit for what they give. Every kindness has a price tag, even if no one says it out loud. I forgot that kindness could just be kindness." Hyun glanced at him, something perceptive in his gaze, as though he understood there was far more to this stranger than he was letting on, but he didn't press. "Whatever you're running from," he said instead, "you're safe here, for as long as you need." Those words settled into Min-yi's chest like something warm. Over the following days, Ha-yoon took it upon herself to keep Mr. company whenever her chores allowed, chattering about everything from her favorite stories to the stray cat that lived near the market to her hopes of becoming a teacher one day. "So I can help kids the way my daddy helps everyone." "Do you have a family, mister?" she asked him one afternoon, sitting cross-legged beside him while he rested against the wall of the small yard. The question caught him off guard. "I did, a long time ago. My parents passed when I was young. I was raised by people who taught me how to survive, not exactly how to be a family." Ha-yoon considered this with the serious thoughtfulness only children seem capable of. "That's sad, but you can borrow ours for a while if you want. Daddy says the more people you love, the richer you are, even if we don't have much money." Min-yi felt something tighten in his throat. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is," she said proudly, "the wisest man I know." Days folded into each other, and with each one, the walls Min-yi had built around himself, walls constructed brick by brick through years of betrayal, violence, and the crushing loneliness of power, began, slowly, to erode. He found himself laughing genuinely at Ha-yoon's stories. He found himself moved nearly to tears watching Hyun gently comb Yoon-jae's hair each night before bed, whispering reassurances even when his own eyes were heavy with exhaustion. He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, feeling something like peace. But peace, he knew, could not last. Not while Director Choi believed him dead, not while an organization teetered on the edge of a war that could still be prevented, but only if Min-yi returned to fight for it. Late one night, after the family had fallen asleep, Min-yi slipped outside and made a call on a phone Hyun didn't know he still carried, dialing a number known only to the one bodyguard he trusted without question. "It's me," Min-yi said quietly when the call connected. "I'm alive." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Sir, we thought, where are you? We've been searching every—" "Listen carefully. I need a vehicle before sunrise. No sirens, no attention, and I need you to keep this quiet. No one knows I'm alive except you. Not yet. Not until I understand exactly who did this." "You already suspect someone." Min-yi's gaze drifted toward the small house behind him, warm light flickering faintly through the window despite the late hour. "I suspect everyone right now, but there's someone who benefited most from that meeting going wrong. I need proof before I move." "Understood. I'll be there before dawn." Min-yi ended the call and stood in the quiet yard for a long moment, staring up at a sky full of stars, he hadn't properly looked at in years. Somewhere behind him, tangled up in guilt and gratitude and something that felt dangerously close to belonging, was a family who had saved his life without asking for anything at all. He owed them everything, and he intended someday to repay that debt in full. Before sunrise, an ordinary, unremarkable car pulled quietly to the edge of the neighborhood. Minyi stood at the doorway of the small house, dressed once again in a borrowed jacket that didn't quite fit, looking at the family who had, in the span of little more than a week, given him back something he thought he'd lost forever. "You're leaving," Dehyun said. "It wasn't a question." "I have to. There are things I need to set right." Minyi hesitated, then reached into his pocket, producing a small folded bill, not extravagant, careful not to arouse suspicion, but enough to help. "Please, for Yoonjai's medicine." Dehyun's hand hovered over the money before he gently pushed it back. "We didn't help you for payment." "I know," Minyi said, his voice thick. "That's exactly why I need you to take it." After a long pause, Dehyun accepted it, understanding the gesture for what it was, not charity, but gratitude that needed somewhere to go. Ha-Yoon, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, wrapped her small arms around Minyi's waist in a hug he hadn't expected and didn't want to end. "Will you come back, mister?" Minyi knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that surprised even him. "I don't know when," he said honestly, "but I promise you this, I will never forget what your family did for me. Never." "Okay," Ha-Yoon said, smiling despite the tears gathering in her eyes, the resilient acceptance of a child who had already learned that goodbyes were sometimes necessary. "Be safe, mister." He climbed into the waiting car without looking back, because he knew if he looked back, he might not have the strength to leave at all. As the vehicle pulled away into the pale light of early morning, Ha-Yoon stood at the gate, waving until the car disappeared entirely, believing, with the quiet sadness of a child, that this was the last time she would ever see him. She had no idea how wrong she was. We're at the halfway point now, and if this story has grabbed hold of you the way we hope it has, take just a second to like this video. It genuinely helps more people discover stories like this one, and trust us, the second half is where everything changes. Minyi disappeared into a safe house on the far edge of the city, a property so obscure and unassuming that even most of his own organization didn't know it existed. Only 3 people knew he was alive: his trusted bodyguard, a discreet physician who tended to what remained of his wound, and eventually, Taejun, who wept openly, an almost unheard-of display from a man known for his stoicism, when he saw Minyi standing alive in the dim light of the safe house. "We thought you were dead," Taejun said, his voice breaking. "The whole organization thinks you're dead. Choi has already begun consolidating power, positioning himself as the natural successor, mourning you publicly while quietly moving pieces into place." "Then let him keep believing it," Minyi said, his voice cold and calculated in a way it hadn't been in weeks. The warmth he'd found in that small house lingered somewhere beneath the surface, but here, in the shadows of his old life, the strategist in him had reawakened. A dead man can move unseen. Choi won't be careful if he thinks there's no one left to be careful of. Over the following weeks, Minyi worked with a patience that surprised even Taejun. He didn't rush toward confrontation. Instead, he rebuilt, quietly reaching out to loyal contacts one by one, verifying trust before revealing anything, piecing together financial records, communications, and testimonies that slowly painted an undeniable picture. The 3 men who fled through the side exit during the ambush, Taejun reported one evening, spreading documents across a table. We traced their movements. All three received payments the week before the peace meeting, payments originating from an account linked to Director Choi's nephew. Min-yi studied the papers with narrowed eyes. He orchestrated the entire ambush. The peace meeting was never meant to end the war. It was meant to end me. Why? What does he gain? Everything, Min-yi said quietly. With me dead and no clear successor, the elders would have had no choice but to turn to him for stability. He'd inherit control of the organization without ever having to fight for it openly. Weeks stretched into months. Min-yi's network grew, cautious and covert, until he had assembled not just evidence, but testimony from men who had grown disillusioned with Choi's increasingly ruthless consolidation of power, men who had watched loyal soldiers pushed aside, watched fear replace respect, and who were relieved more than anything to learn their true leader still lived. Throughout it all, in quiet moments between meetings and strategy sessions, Min-yi's mind returned again and again to a small house with a wooden fence, to a girl's unwavering kindness, to a father's quiet strength, to a mother fighting for her life with nothing but love and stubbornness keeping her going. He thought of them not as an obligation, but as an anchor proof that somewhere in this world he had built his life around, something pure and untainted still existed. He made discreet inquiries, careful never to expose the family to any risk. He learned that Yoon-jae's condition had worsened slightly before stabilizing, that Di-hyun continued working himself to exhaustion, that Ha-yoon had started school again after a brief absence to help nurse her mother. Every piece of information he gathered strengthened his resolve. Finally, the evidence was complete. Min-yi called for a gathering of the organization's senior leadership, a summit that Director Choi, still believing himself secure in his position, attended with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. The moment Min-yi walked into that room, very much alive, the color drained entirely from Choi's face. Gasps rippled through the gathered elders. Whispers of disbelief turned quickly to stunned silence as Min-yi took his place at the head of the table, calm, composed, every inch the leader he had always been, perhaps, now more so than ever. "You look surprised, Director Choi," Min-yi said evenly. "I suppose a ghost returning tends to have that effect." "Min-yi," Choi stammered, quickly composing himself into something resembling relief. "We feared the worst. Thank the heavens you survived, "Save it," Min-yi interrupted, his voice sharpening like steel. He gestured to Taejun, who began distributing copies of the evidence they had gathered to every elder seated at the table. "Financial records, testimony, communications between your nephew and the three men who staged their escape during the ambush. The same three men who, conveniently, were never actually in danger because they knew exactly when the shooting would start." The room erupted into low murmurs as elders began flipping through the documents, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "This is fabricated," Choi snapped, though sweat had begun beating at his temple. "A desperate attempt to—" "The bank records aren't fabricated," Min-yi said calmly. "The witness testimonies aren't fabricated. And this," he added, sliding one final document across the table, "is a recorded confession from one of the shooters who was quite eager to cooperate once he understood the alternative." Choi's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, methodically assembled over months of patient, careful work. One of the eldest elders, a man who had known Min-yi's father and had watched Min-yi grow from a boy into a leader, spoke first, his voice heavy with disappointment. You tried to murder your own successor. You would have plunged this entire organization into chaos and bloodshed for your own ambition. It wasn't ambition, Choi said, desperation cracking his voice for the first time. It was necessity. Minyi's peace agreement would have weakened us, made us vulnerable too. Enough, Minyi said, and something in his tone silenced the room completely. You didn't act out of necessity, Choi. You acted out of greed, and you were willing to sacrifice everything, the peace, the lives of everyone in that room, the future of this entire organization, to seize power you were never meant to hold. The elders voted unanimously. By the end of that meeting, Director Choi had lost everything: his position, his influence, his standing among men who had once respected him. He was escorted out under guard, his protests fatting into the hallway, while the peace agreement Minyi had fought so hard to establish remained intact, stronger now than ever, born from a betrayal that had ultimately failed. There were no gunfights in that final confrontation. No explosions, no chase scenes. Just truth, patiently gathered and unflinchingly presented, dismantling a lie built on ambition and blood. If you've made it this far, we appreciate you more than you know. This is exactly the moment in the story where everything the characters have suffered starts to pay off, so stay with us, because the ending is coming, and it's the part you won't want to miss. With Choi removed and the organization stabilized under his renewed leadership, Minyi finally allowed himself to turn his attention to something that had been quietly burning in his chest for months, a debt of gratitude he intended to repay properly. He arranged everything with the same meticulous care he'd applied to gathering evidence against Choi, but this time, driven by something far warmer than strategy. He contacted the finest specialist in the city, a doctor whose expertise in respiratory illness was unmatched, and arranged for Yoon Jae to receive a full course of advanced treatment. Quietly, discreetly, framed as part of a charitable medical program, so the family would never feel burdened by the scale of the gift. He found a modest but comfortable home in a peaceful neighborhood, sunlight-filled and spacious, with a proper garden where Ha-yoon could play and a quiet room where Yoon Jae could recover in comfort. And for Di-hyun, a man who had spent his life sacrificing everything for his family, who had carved toys by firelight because he couldn't afford anything else, who had opened his home to a bleeding stranger without a moment's hesitation, Minyi arranged something he knew would mean more than any amount of money ever could. A fully equipped carpentry workshop, stocked with the finest tools and materials, along with the connections needed to turn his craftsmanship into a proper, thriving business. On a warm afternoon months after he'd first stumbled bleeding into their lives, Minyi returned to the small house with the wooden fence, dressed simply, deliberately leaving behind any trace of the power and wealth that defined his world. Ha-yoon was in the front yard when she saw him approaching, and for a moment she simply stared, as though her mind couldn't quite process what her eyes were showing her. Then a smile broke across her face, wide and radiant, and she ran toward him with her arms outstretched. "Mister, you came back. You really came back." Minyi knelt down and caught her in a hug, laughing, actually laughing freely in a way he hadn't in years. "I told you I would. I never forget a debt, little one, especially not this one." Di-hyun emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet joy at the sight of the man he'd nursed back to health. "You look well," he said, gripping Minyi's hand firmly. "Healthier than the last time I saw you." "Because of you," Minyi said sincerely. "Because of your family, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, but I intend to try." He led them, gently insistent despite their confused protests, to a car waiting outside, the same kind of ordinary, unremarkable vehicle he'd left in months before, though this time it carried him toward them instead of away. The drive to the new house was filled with Ha-Yoon's excited chatter, questions tumbling out one after another that Min-yi answered with a patient smile, refusing to reveal anything until they arrived. When the car finally stopped in front of the sunlit house with its neat garden and welcoming porch, the family stepped out in stunned silence. "Mr. Dehyun said slowly, 'What is this? Whose house is this?' "Yours," Min-yi said simply, placing a set of keys into Dehyun's calloused, trembling hands. "Yoon-jae's treatment has already been arranged with the city's finest specialist. There's a workshop out back, fully equipped, waiting for your hands to bring it to life. This is yours, all of it." Dehyun stared at the keys, then at the house, then at Min-yi, his composed strength finally cracking under the weight of overwhelming emotion. "I don't understand. We only did what any decent person would do. We didn't save you for this." "I know," Min-yi said, his voice thick with feeling. "That's exactly why you deserve it. You gave me something I'd forgotten existed, a family that asks for nothing and gives everything. I can't repay kindness like that with money, but I can make sure you never have to sacrifice yourselves to exhaustion again. I can make sure I gets to watch Ha-Yoon grow up. That's not charity, that's gratitude." Yoon-jae, walking slowly but steadily beside her husband, stronger now than she'd been in months, thanks to treatment already underway, reached out and took Min-yi's hand in both of hers, tears streaming freely down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing my family the way we are, and not the way the world usually sees people like us." That evening, as the sun dipped low over their new home, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, the family gathered around a simple table for their first meal in their new life: rice, vegetables, a modest soup, nothing extravagant because extravagance was never what mattered to them. Min-yi sat among them, not as a powerful leader, not as a stranger, but as something he hadn't been in longer than he could remember: family. Ha-Yoon reached across the table and took his hand on one side, her mother's hand on the other, forming an unbroken circle around the table that felt, in that quiet golden light, unshakably whole. "I'm glad I found you that day," Ha-Yoon said softly, "even though you were scary and covered in blood." Min-yi laughed, squeezing her small hand gently. "I'm glad you found me too. It was the luckiest moment of my life." Outside, the world continued its endless churn of ambition and betrayal and struggle, the same world Min-yi had spent his life navigating, hardened by its cruelty. But inside that small, warm home, none of that mattered. What mattered was a table full of people who had chosen kindness even when they had nothing to gain from it, and a man who had learned in the most unexpected way that the greatest power in the world was not fear, not control, not wealth, but love, freely given, and just as freely returned. The greatest acts of kindness are often done by people who have the least to give. And sometimes, one small act, a child's hand reaching out to a stranger, can change a lifetime.
Thank you so much for watching our
If this story touched your heart, please give it.
Share this story with your friends so they can enjoy it too.
Subscribe now. Another unforgettable story is coming soon.
Bye.